The story of Atari is one of the most insane stories in gaming. From being the pioneers of gaming as a whole to launching a cryptocurrency, a brand of hot sauce, and themed hotels, this company has somehow just managed to keep their head above water for over 50 years. It's been sold 6 times, had 10 different CEOs, and has directly led to the creation of Activision, Bandai Namco, Apple, and even Chuck E. Cheese. Everywhere you look in gaming history, Atari has somehow been there, standing in the corner like that party hat guy in that one meme, while all the other big gaming companies are off celebrating their gazillion dollars of profit. The company has basically died multiple times, and today I'm going to tell you how one of gaming's most iconic brands dropped the ball so badly. This is the story of how Atari died like 5 different times. And to tell it, we gotta start with something kind of interesting. Did you know that there was a computer game that existed in 1962? This was over a year before computer mouses were even a thing, and a decade before the first commercially successful arcade game, Pong, was released by Atari. It was called Space War, and it had to be played on the PDP-1 computer, which cost over $120,000 to buy, more than $1 million when adjusted for inflation today. It wasn't played with a disc or with a downloadable program. No, you put a literal piece of paper into this massive machine and watch the beauty unfold. It was revolutionary for all 53 people who purchased a PDP-1 computer. Because, see, this was far before the days of computers being that cool new thing in your grandma's basement, unless your grandma happened to be the entirety of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. These computers were pretty much only available to electrical engineering students at the largest institutions and universities around the United States. Nolan Bushnell was one of these students. He attended the University of Utah in the mid-60s, and he thought Space War and video games on computers were the future. When he got a job at a company called Ampex, he met Ted Dabney, and they became fast friends. Bushnell and Dabney founded Atari in 1971, quitting their jobs at Ampex and partnering with a company called Nutting Associates to create the first arcade video game, Computer Space. And, well, nobody played it at all. Exactly why you don't work with a company with such a tragic name. I'd make a video on why this game failed, but I can summarize pretty quickly by showcasing you the setup manual that Jim from the local bar would need to use to install this thing. So they sat down and tried working on something new, something a little less complicated. It was an arcade cabinet called Pong, and it would lead to Atari becoming recognized as the pioneers of the entire gaming industry. But here's the crazy part. Atari actually stole the concept of Pong from another company and got sued in court because of it. Now we have to introduce Ralph H. Baer, a guy who was quietly inventing the home console while Atari was focusing on arcade cabinets. On September 1st of 1966, he documented his concepts for a home console system, and by 1967, his employer, Lockheed, the people who produce missiles and fighter jets for the US military, had patented those concepts. Lockheed partnered with a company called Magnavox to release the Odyssey home console in March of 1972 for $100, the first of its kind. The Odyssey released with 12 different games built in, and to modest success. Over the next year, it sold 165,000 systems, with the number climbing to 350,000 by 1975. And one of its games should look familiar: table tennis. 9 months later, on November 29, 1972, Atari released their hit arcade game Pong. And as you can see, there are a lot of similarities here. But while the Odyssey was a bit of a flop and table tennis slid under the radar, Pong was a massive breakout success for Atari, and it generated over $1 million per month in revenue for the company. So, unsurprisingly, Magnavox took Atari right to court for stealing the concept of their game. Magnavox actually had records that indicated Noah Bushnell directly attended one of their demos for table tennis on the Odyssey on May 24th, 1972, just a few months before Atari released their Pong arcade cabinet. So the case seemed clear. Atari had blatantly stolen Magnavox's product and made millions of dollars off of it. The case would have cost millions more to fight, and it was definitely an uphill battle to say the least, so Atari, just over a year into their existence, settled the lawsuit for $1.5 million. And that turned out to be a great decision. The myth that Nolan Bushnell invented video games took hold partly because he never corrected the narrative, and he pushed co-founder Ted Dabney out of the company as early as 1973. While this distorted Atari's origin story, the company's impact was very real. It did help to popularize video games, and it launched careers, including that of Steve Jobs, who worked at Atari in 1974 and contributed to the development of Breakout with Steve Wozniak, which led to the two becoming partners in founding Apple. Small world. While off to a controversial start, Atari's culture of innovation helped shape both the gaming industry and the early tech boom. So it makes it even more surprising when you find out where the company stands today in comparison. But we'll get back to that in a second. After the release of Pong, Atari was doing alright. They had a lot of revenue from the sales of the arcade cabinet, but they reinvested heavily into the company to encourage growth. They started by trying to open a Japanese division in August of 1973, but due to the country's wildly different laws, it turned out to be a catastrophic failure. It left Bushnell with little choice but to sell off the division to a company called Namco for a modest sum of $500,000. Funny enough, this deal allowed Namco to enter the gaming market and become the titan that we all know today. So even this early into the story, Atari can be directly thanked for the success of both Apple and Bandai Namco, and we're just getting started. After the failure of the Japanese division, Atari was still on the verge of bankruptcy and had to let half of its employees go to survive. They needed something to bring them back to life, and they needed it fast. So when they released 1974's hit title Tank, and it almost single-handedly fixed all of their financial problems, Bushnell was overjoyed and was ready to keep growing the company. And next up, he wanted to aim for the home market. So after some brainstorming sessions in the company hot tub with beers and joints in hand, the company managed to produce a device capable of playing Pong from the comfort of your home. That's it. That's the revolutionary invention. Oh, and it cost over $500 when adjusted for inflation. They wanted to take it to the next level and produce what would later become the Atari Video Computer System. But the $500 Pong home machine didn't quite do it for the company from a financial perspective, so Bushnell had to sell the company. That's how Warner Communications acquired Atari for $28 million in November of 1976. With the funding from Warner, Atari managed to produce the home console that put video games on the map. When the Atari VCS came out in September of 1977, it was practically printing money for the company. It turned Atari into the fastest growing company in US history at the time, and accounted for over a third of Warner's income. This was the greatest moment in Atari's history, and from here, the entirety of the rest of this story is all downhill. I'm not even kidding. Somehow, this company would manage to take one of the greatest success stories in business history and turn it into nearly 40 years of fumbling blindly in the dark, doing everything wrong, and barely staying afloat. Trust me, it's a journey, so you may want to sit down for this part. But how can you sit down when your chair looks like this? Ew, gross. You expect me to game and edit videos in a chair that looks like it was acquired in a 1970s Atari liquidation sale? No thanks. That's why I switched to FlexiSpot and the C7 Max, the sponsor of today's video. I sit in a chair for way too much time every day because I have no life, so having a good one absolutely saves my back and my posture. The C7 Max has a 3D adjustable headrest that helps you know when to shut down terrible company ideas, like an Atari cryptocurrency token, a backrest that can be adjusted to your height, and even ergonomic lumbar support, so that your back doesn't hurt from carrying the weight of a dying company on your shoulders. It is the most comfortable chair I've ever used, and if you game or work from home, I promise that it'll upgrade your setup and make it all the more enjoyable. The memory foam seat cushion allows for up to 12 hours of sitting without it getting uncomfortable. It has an armrest that can be adjusted to your preferences, whether you're gaming or typing, and oh boy, can this baby recline. If you're interested in upgrading your setup and using the most comfortable chair on the market, check out the FlexiSpot line of gaming and office chairs using my link in the description. They have a 30-day return policy and a 10-year warranty, so check them out using my code in the description for the best prices available. Now, let's get back to the never-ending saga of how Atari completely fumbled their legacy. Once the honeymoon period ended after the release of the VCS, the issues started to pile up between Warner and Atari. Bushnell was well known at Atari for encouraging a laid-back, friendlier culture that involved partying, pranks, and illicit substances. But this informal attitude, plus their laid-back marketing, didn't go over well with Warner's strict upper management. By December of 1978, these antics convinced the head at Warner that Bushnell wasn't taking the job seriously and that they'd made a mistake investing in Atari. You know, despite being worth $2 billion. It led to increasing conflict between Bushnell and Warner, which culminated in the board firing Bushnell altogether in 1979. It was a shock to the company's morale. Nobody trusted the new CEO, Ray Kasser, who graduated from Harvard and clearly came from wealth. That wasn't going to go over well with the hippie engineers. Bushnell was furious, so he had a revenge plan. To create a chain of children's arcade pizza restaurants called Chuck E. Cheese that would later become dilapidated due to the expansion of the internet, causing Scott Cawthon to eventually create Five Nights at Freddy's, which would have multiple spin-offs and sequels, leading to the creation of the Five Nights at Freddy's cinematic universe, with movies published by no other than Universal Pictures, the arch nemesis and competitor of Warner. Nolan was playing the long game here. Anyways, Kasser, the new CEO, did himself no favors by decorating his new office with lavish goods, hiring fancy chefs, and installing high-grade security systems that practically screamed, "I don't trust my employees," all while paying his staff less than $30,000 a year. On top of that, he made it company policy that programmers couldn't be credited for their work at a time when games were largely created by one or two people. Pretty much every employee started to hate working at the company. The focus had shifted from making quality products to whatever made the most money. Alan Miller, alongside 3 other programmers, got fed up and tried to negotiate a better contract. Their terms were rejected, so 4 of Atari's best programmers left to go form their own company, Activision, who would continue to produce games for the Atari VCS by becoming the first independent publisher in the industry. Over in Japan, Namco released Pac-Man in July of 1980. Namco had first approached Atari about licensing the game, but Atari said no, allowing Midway to snatch up the rights. They regretted that when the game became one of the biggest hits of all time in arcades. And to make matters worse, they unwittingly destroyed their chances with the sequel as well. Since Atari had sued the General Computer Corporation over releasing a conversion kit for Atari's Missile Command in 1981, they obviously never approached Atari about their upcoming kit for Pac-Man. So they went to Namco, where it was transformed into Mrs. Pac-Man. Again, one of the most successful arcade games of all time. Atari did later get the rights to make console ports of all of Namco's arcade titles for a measly $1 million, an outrageously good deal, but management fired the guy responsible for making it. It was becoming more and more obvious that Atari management knew nothing about video games or even running a company. With every failure, they worsened their position in the fledgling gaming industry and created yet another competitor. So when the Atari 5200 released in November of 1982, it comes as no surprise that it was a massive disappointment. It couldn't play the last generation's games, it just had a few exclusive titles, and the controllers just sucked. It was more powerful than a lot of hardware at the time, but without new games to take advantage of that fact, it was pointless. The problem only got worse when Atari saw the low sales figures for the 5200 and decided that making games for the new console wasn't worth it. Instead, they just continued producing games for the original VCS, which just made the lack of exclusives even worse, resulting in a revised 5200 model coming out in 1983 that finally made it backwards compatible. But it was too little too late. The 5200 only ended up selling around 1 million copies, less than 5% of what its predecessor had sold. It was already an absurdly bad flop, but Warner was somehow determined to one-up it all in the same year. Atari created a Pac-Man port for the VCS, and it was considered one of the worst ports ever made at the time. Despite that, and the fact that there were only 10 million actively used Atari systems in existence, they produced 12 million copies of the game. So even though the game sold really well at 7.7 million copies, there were still 4.3 million cartridges left over. Low-quality third-party games were already becoming a huge issue in the 80s, and Atari destroyed their brand image by reinforcing this idea and proving that you couldn't even rely on big names to make a good game. This could have been written off as a one-time mistake, but then, after both of these fumbles with producing a bad Pac-Man port and ordering way too many cartridges, Atari managed to also release the most infamous video game of all time, E.T. This mess began when Steve Ross, the head of Warner Communications, spent $21 million getting the licensing rights for an E.T. video game. It meant that the game had to sell at least 4 million copies to break even, more or less make a profit. That alone already warrants some colorful words. But then, Ross only gave the team 5 weeks to develop the game to ship for the holidays. For reference, 6 months was the standard development cycle. Then, 5 million cartridges were produced and shipped to distributors. 3.5 million of those cartridges were shipped straight back to Atari. Paired with Pac-Man, that meant Atari had at least 7.8 million cartridges of games that nobody wanted to buy. As you probably know, E.T. ended up being one of the most critically hated titles in history, on top of all of that other stuff, eradicating what was left of Atari's goodwill. But wait, there's still more. Atari attempted to get rid of some of these excess cartridges by dumping it in a landfill in New Mexico. Countless cartridges and other products were dumped, crushed with a steamroller, and then covered in cement, presumably to stop resellers from getting their hands on them, which just gave the media yet another reason to tear into Atari even more. Their PR team must have hated their jobs. In all, that meant 4 back-to-back disasters for Atari in the span of just 1 year. And the cherry on top is how it came at the worst time imaginable. The competition in the gaming market was fierce in the 80s. New consoles, publishers, and developers were all aiming for a piece of the pie. But just about every game coming out was hot garbage, which drove consumers off. It culminated in the video game crash of 1983, which resulted in stores refusing to carry Atari's truly awful products. It cost Atari at least $500 million and dethroned them as the king of the industry permanently. The CEO, Ray Kasser, resigned and Warner Communications' stock plummeted, so Warner panicked. They sold the consumer division of Atari to Tramiel Technologies and rebranded the company to Atari Corporation. The rest of the company became the Atari Games Corporation and basically just served as an arcade publisher that worked with Namco. On the surface, Tramiel Technology was actually a pretty solid candidate for Atari. It was a company established by Jack Tramiel, a founder of Commodore International, which at the time was one of the main computer manufacturers. After a falling out with Irving Gould at Commodore, Tramiel left the company and established Tramiel Technology. It wasn't long before it effectively purchased Atari and set its sights on launching new computers to compete with Commodore. The thing is, Tramiel had a notorious reputation for micromanagement, penny pinching, and being a total hard-ass in business negotiations. When he took over, he ruthlessly fired hundreds of employees, and nobody really liked him. So the change in leadership did little to repair Atari's shattered reputation. Still, he proved he could run a successful business, so maybe he could fix the checkbooks. After a year of work under Tramiel, the Atari ST computer was released in June of 1985. It was pretty popular, especially in Europe, netting the company a solid profit. Following that was the Atari 2600 Junior and Atari 7800 in 1986, which helped generate $25 million that year. A comeback was starting to seem possible, but Atari still needed to convince distributors to put their products back on shelves. This led Atari to purchase the Federated Group, a chain of retailers, on August 23, 1987 for $67.3 million. But Atari clearly failed to do their homework on the company, as on February 15, 1988, an audit revealed that the Federation Group's net worth was actually $33 million lower than Atari believed. They had basically been scammed. By the end of 1988, the Federated Group had lost them another $67 million through operational losses. They got rid of it the next year, but the damage had already been done. On the bright side, Atari did make $452 million in sales that year through its computers, but it seemed like a lucky fluke. Following this up, they were about to release an innovative new console, the Atari Lynx, which was the first handheld console, which is what I would have said if Nintendo hadn't beaten them to the market. Not only that, but Nintendo absolutely crushed them. There were a lot of issues with the Lynx. It cost $190, chewed through AA batteries, was understocked, and didn't have a ton of great games. Meanwhile, Nintendo's Game Boy had none of those issues, came out a month before the Lynx, and came with Tetris. It didn't completely fail, as it did sell over 2 million units, it just wasn't the gargantuan hit that Atari was expecting, especially when compared to the Game Boy. But that didn't deter Atari, and they went right back to the drawing board for their next console. Rather than attempting to compete with the omnipresent Game Boy, they returned to the home console market. Initially, this took the form of the Atari Panther, but it ended up getting shelved in favor of a much more ambitious design, the Atari Jaguar. The Jaguar was going to be the first 64-bit console, which was a massive step up over the 16-bit Super Nintendo and Game Gear. The system released on November 23, 1993, which was years before the N64 or PlayStation. It was extremely ahead of its time, but despite that, it failed to find an audience, only selling 150,000 units. So nobody bought it, and it was another catastrophic failure for the company. But even after this failure, there was still a bunch of cash in reserves, somehow, which doesn't make any sense because it seemed like Atari didn't know how to do anything except fail around this time. But without any new systems being sold, the writing was on the wall. It was going to be a slow death for Atari. So Tramiel was done, and he wanted out, so he sold Atari again to the JTS Corporation. By February 13, 1996, Atari was effectively no more. Even if the company were to come back from the grave, not a single person who made it such a special place even worked there anymore. It languished in limbo for 2 years before Hasbro Interactive purchased it in 1998. Their plan was to focus on re-releasing retro titles and publishing new titles like Roller Coaster Tycoon. It was nice, but this wouldn't last for long. Hasbro Interactive was struggling financially, and at the time, a French company called Infogrames was purchasing companies and franchises left and right in the gaming industry. So when they saw Hasbro Interactive struggling, they were eager to snatch it up for $100 million in December of 2000. To no one's surprise, the corporate mass of Infogrames had no idea what to do with Atari once they had it. By October 2001, they started to make an effort to reinvent it as a publisher for edgier sports titles. By May of 2003, it wasn't a monstrous success, but it did actually turn a decent profit. So Infogrames decided that it was a good idea to rebrand most of its subsidiaries as Atari, creating a confusing mess of branding. Clearly, Infogrames really wanted to capitalize on the Atari brand, but all they were doing was publishing a bunch of mediocre games. Their most lucrative titles weren't even from franchises that they owned, it was Dragon Ball Z games that they were licensing, and their sales figures reflected that. From 2005 to 2008, the profits from publishing declined each year. It started at $290 million in 2005 to $70 million in 2008. That might have been alright if Infogrames hadn't gobbled up all those other companies and debts, but they had. In order to keep the ship afloat, Infogrames began to offload some weight by selling off the properties that it had been hoarding. Without substantial change though, this was just delaying the inevitable. They were losing more and more money every single year. Atari suffered yet another loss of $71 million in 2008, and then $319 million in 2009. They just kept circling the drain until January 21st, 2013, when Atari finally had to file for bankruptcy. Over 100 titles and IPs were sold off, and the company shrank to just 10 employees. It was clear that only the most qualified of businessmen could salvage this sinking ship. So, Frederick Chesnace, one of the few remaining shareholders for Atari, took the helm. You might know him for being the primary investor on the hit game Infestation Survivor Stories, or as it's better known, The War Z. I'm dead serious when I say that. If you want more information, we did a huge video on that game's own disastrous history. So that's one heck of a vote of confidence, and I'm sure this guy's gonna do great things at Atari. Bankruptcy was tough, but it was a chance for Atari to start from a mostly clean slate and reevaluate what the direction of the company really was. And Chesnace believed that entering social casino gaming is a logical next step for us. Alongside the social casinos, Chesnace had plans to release new video games. The titles planned to release across 2015 and 2016 were Alone in the Dark Illumination, Roller Coaster Tycoon World, a mobile port of Lunar Lander, and Pride Fest. And Pride Fest, Well, I don't think I really need to explain what happened here. Atari was somehow putting out products that could have been generated by AI if the AI was brain dead and pandering to the LGBTQ community. When 2017 rolled around, GameSpot broke the news on January 3rd that Atari was being sued by Frontier Developments. Atari had failed to pay the developer its owed royalties for Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. They'd only paid $1.17 million instead of the full $3.37 million. This was extraordinarily shady, unprofessional, and not the last time that something like this would happen. You'd think the story would be over at this point, but somehow the blunders just kept happening. It genuinely blows my mind how badly this company's been run, basically since its inception, and there's still more to come. In the same year as the Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 disaster, Atari teased that they had a new console in development on June 8, 2017. Because that went well the last 5 times. It was called the Atari Box, later renamed to the Atari VCS. They ran an Indiegogo campaign to fund the system, raising $3 million from over 11,000 backers. It was supposed to be able to browse the internet and stream media like a computer, have the hardware capabilities of the PS4 and Xbox One, and the ability to play every retro Atari title ever made. Development was being led by Rob Wyatt, one of the developers of the original Xbox. Not only that, but it would release in just 1 year. It promised a lot and sounded awesome if you didn't think critically about any of it. Naturally, when June 2019 rolled around, delays were announced. The project went radio silent apart from periodic delays, causing many to question whether or not the product was even real. In the meantime, Atari had other mischief to get up to. Atari Hotels were announced on January 27th, 2020. Atari Hotels level up hotel entertainment with fully immersive experiences for every age and gaming ability, including the latest in VR and AR. Select hotels will also feature state-of-the-art venues and studios to accommodate esports events. I mean, who better to lead this kind of groundbreaking project than a company that can't make functional games or pay their developers? The project status is unclear right now, with only 2 blog posts on the official website. Both were in 2020, so it's possible that the project's just being quietly swept under the rug. Looking at the unrealistic promo images, that's probably for the best. But this wasn't the only eyebrow raiser in 2020 though. Then, news broke on April 2nd that Atari was being sued by the VCS's lead architect, Rob Wyatt. They had also failed to pay him for 6 whole months, owing more than $250,000 according to the lawsuit. Then, on May 14th, Atari announced an Atari token cryptocurrency. It launched in October alongside an announcement that the upcoming Atari VCS would now integrate cryptocurrency technologies. I think this is the last YouTube video I'm ever making. During its initial pre-sales, it raised $1.5 million. When it went live in October, it presumably made a lot of money before the inevitable rug pull that left all the poor buyers with worthless images that they spent thousands of dollars on. They never really had any functionality besides gambling in digital casinos to get more tokens. The token thing only lasted a couple of years as Atari terminated all business relations with the company behind its creation on April 18th, 2022. You had 2 weeks to exchange your tokens to some random currency, and if you missed the window, you were now stuck with your snake oil. But hey, we have some good news. To many people's surprise, the Atari VCS started shipping to backers on December 14th, 2020. Turns out, it was real after all. That was an issue though, considering the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X had released just a month prior. The console hadn't even fully released yet, and it was already a generation behind. When the first reviews came out, it was obvious that Atari's console couldn't hold a candle to the competition. Pretty much every aspect of the device proved to be awkward, clunky, and inferior to just about any alternative. The controllers felt cheap, the UI lagged at times, the PC mode was frustrating to use, and you didn't even get all classic Atari titles with the console. Jason Faulkner of Game Revolution concluded his review saying, "I would be surprised if the Atari VCS even reaches the Ouya's level of popularity," which was pretty brutal, yet true. And if you don't know what the Ouya is, then you just proved his point. Nobody's buying this thing. 2 months later, Chesnais resigned from Atari's board of directors in order to focus on his own company, Crypto Blockchain Industries. But he did maintain a license between Atari and CBI, making him a pretty penny on the way out. This changed pretty much nothing for the Atari VCS, which fully launched on June 15th, 2021 for $300 plus $60 for a controller. That's the same as a Nintendo Switch. So nobody bought it, with Atari's hardware sales sitting at a pitiful $2.3 million for 2021 and $230,000 in 2022. It was yet another critical and commercial flop for Atari, and if this company wanted to keep kicking along, things needed to change. And for just a moment, that seemed possible. On July 5th, 2021, Atari Gaming announced a return to publishing and an effort to move away from free-to-play mobile titles. Then on March 30th, 2022, all deals between Atari and Chessnace were ended, fully cementing the change in direction for the company. But the kinds of games that they've released since then are interesting, to say the least. That includes, but isn't limited to, Combinera, Breakout Recharged, Gravitar Recharged, Yars Recharged, and Atari Mania. According to SteamDB, not one of these games has ever had more than 15 concurrent players. The biggest success has been Atari 50, but even that failed to break 80 concurrent players on SteamDB. In December, they stopped producing new units for the VCS, instead focusing on getting rid of what's left over. It was just a matter of time until the company fully collapsed. But somehow, they just kept hanging on like they had been for over 4 decades. In November of 2023, Atari released one of their best products in ages, the Atari 2600 Plus. It was a mini console that could play just about any Atari 2600 and 7800 cartridge without the hassle of finding an original console and hooking it up. It was great for collectors and retro enthusiasts alike and breathed life into a modern homebrew scene. This system, paired with the 7800 Plus in 2024, paved the way for Atari's best fiscal year in a decade. They made $36 million from the latest fiscal year, which is the second in a row that's turned a profit, which was also a milestone that they hit back in 1975. At least they're back to where they started, I guess. Given the company's exceptionally troubled history, this slight profit is a sight for sore eyes. They still continue to do some questionable things like starting an Atari hot sauce line, but at least they aren't trying to compete with players out of their league. It remains to be seen whether or not they'll keep up the momentum or if they'll drop the ball for the millionth time. There's at least 5 points you could pick out as the death of Atari. Was it when Bushnell sold the company to Warner, or when he left the company? What about when E.T. was released, or when the company declared bankruptcy? The matter of why Atari failed to reach its potential is pretty complex, but there does seem to be one constant throughout it all: an unwillingness to change and management refusing to listen to anyone. Despite Atari's failings though, they've managed to contribute an astronomical amount to the world in their time. We can thank them for creating Namco, Activision, Chuck E. Cheese, and to a degree Apple. Many former Atari employees, such as Mark Cerny, have had highly successful careers as well. In Cerny's case, he was the lead architect for the PlayStation 5, which is one heck of a step up from making Marble Madness. But while Atari has managed to lift hundreds of others, it's struggled to actually succeed as a business. There's at least been a flicker of hope in the past couple of years, so maybe things are starting to change after 4 decades of failure. And that is the complicated history of Atari. What are your thoughts on this company? From blockchain to hotels to straight up just bad business decisions, their journey has been an interesting one. Did you play any old Atari games? What did I miss? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to check out FlexiSpot using my link in the description, and if you're interested in getting some of those free game keys that I mentioned earlier, consider joining the Discord, which is also linked below as well. I will see you guys next time, and peace.